Hey guys, tonight we follow the story of a man who moved through the Mafia's highest ranks without ever chasing the spotlight. Yet his name commanded respect in every corner of New York's underworld. He came up in the rough streets of Little Italy, earned his stripes the hard way, and rose to become underboss of the Gambino crime family during its most powerful years. We're talking about Aniello Dellacroce, the old-school mobster, whose quiet presence carried more weight than 100 loud threats. Picture this. It's the 1970s. The five families have their grip on the city, from the waterfront to the construction sites, from the nightclubs to the backrooms of social clubs. While others chased headlines and glamour, Dellacroce stayed in the shadows, building alliances, settling disputes, and keeping the wheels of the organization turning. He wasn't the kind of man you saw in the newspapers, but if you crossed him, you'd feel his reach no matter where you stood. You might think this is just a story about organized crime, but it's really about discipline, tradition, and the silent authority of a man who lived by the code. It's about how one figure could hold a family together through loyalty and respect, and what happened when the balance of that power began to shift. So, before we dive in, hit that like button if you enjoy these late-night mob tales, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and follow me into the world of Aniello Dellacroce, where power didn't need to shout because it already owned the room. In the narrow streets of Little Italy, Manhattan, where laundry lines swayed above cobblestone alleys and the smell of fresh bread drifted from tiny bakeries, a boy named Aniello Dellacroce grew up learning the quiet language of survival. Born in 1914 to Italian immigrant parents, he was the kind of kid who didn't say much, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Neighbors remembered him as serious, even in childhood, standing apart from the other boys in the street, observing instead of playing. The elders saw in him a kind of discipline that was rare, even in a place where discipline meant survival. Aniello's father worked long hours, his mother kept the home, and the family lived modestly. Money was always tight and opportunities were scarce. In the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of the time, kids often had to choose between two paths: honest hard labor that might never lead to comfort, or the faster, riskier road walked by the older boys who ran errands for local men in sharp suits. Those men carried themselves differently. They didn't shout, didn't rush, yet everyone made room for them when they walked down Mulberry Street, young Aniello noticed. It wasn't the gold jewelry or expensive shoes that caught his attention. It was the quiet authority, the way they never seemed hurried, the way people leaned in to listen when they spoke. In his teenage years, Aniello found himself gravitating toward the streets more often, though not recklessly. He wasn't a brawler looking for trouble, and he wasn't a loud hustler bragging about petty scores. Instead, he was deliberate. He listened. He learned who could be trusted and who couldn't, which doors were open and which were permanently closed. It was around this time that he fell into the orbit of older neighborhood figures tied to the underworld. They recognized something in him, not just toughness, but control. Where other young men might lash out in anger, Aniello could absorb an insult without a word, filing it away for later if needed. That patience would become one of his defining traits. By the time he was in his 20s, the streets of New York were changing. Prohibition had come and gone, leaving behind a network of organized crime stronger and more sophisticated than before. The city was carved into territories, each controlled by different groups who had learned that cooperation, or at least the appearance of it, could be more profitable than open warfare. Aniello began working under established figures who valued reliability over flash. He took on small tasks at first, things that required trust but not headlines. He never bragged about these jobs, never told stories in bars. If you didn't need to know, you didn't know. That was his way. His quiet, methodical approach earned him a reputation in circles that mattered. While some men built their names by being loud, Aniello built his by being the man who could be counted on to get something done without unnecessary noise. Over time, this reputation drew him deeper into the Gambino family's orbit, though back then, the family's leadership was under different names. These were men who had survived the volatile 1930s and were now consolidating power. Aniello's discipline fit perfectly into the old-school way they preferred to operate. The Ravenite Social Club, though not yet the famous headquarters it would become, was already a meeting point for men of influence. Aniello started spending more time there, not to gamble or drink, but to be present, to listen, and to understand the currents moving beneath the surface. He was still a relatively small player, but in the world he was entering, small players with the right qualities could rise quickly if they knew when to speak and when to remain silent. As the years went by, his work expanded. He became known as someone who could mediate disputes, someone whose word carried weight even among men older than him. This was rare in a world where seniority often determined respect. Aniello's respect came from a different source, an aura that combined calmness with the unspoken understanding that he was not to be underestimated. By the mid-1940s, he had established himself as a steady presence in the Gambino family's operations, though still keeping his name far from the newspapers. In those days, invisibility was an asset. The post-war years brought new opportunities for organized crime in New York. The economy was booming, unions were powerful, and there were countless ways for someone with the right connections to profit without drawing attention. Aniello's ability to operate quietly made him invaluable. He began overseeing certain operations in Manhattan, always ensuring that things ran smoothly, that everyone got their fair share, and that problems were solved before they could grow into something larger. People learned that if you dealt with him fairly, he would return the courtesy. But if you tried to take advantage, there would be consequences, delivered without shouting or spectacle. It was during this period that Aniello's personal style became clear. While some of his contemporaries flaunted their wealth with flashy suits and large cars, he preferred a more understated elegance. Well-tailored but not loud, well-spoken but never verbose. His appearance matched his philosophy: control, precision, and discipline in all things. This style also made him harder to target. Law enforcement often kept their eyes on the most visible figures, while men like Aniello moved in the background, quietly becoming indispensable. His rise in the Gambino family was steady, not explosive. This was by design. He wasn't interested in quick leaps that could collapse just as quickly. Instead, he built his position brick by brick, earning the trust of powerful figures like Carlo Gambino himself. Gambino, a man who valued intelligence and discretion, saw in Aniello a kindred spirit. The two shared an understanding that the true strength of a leader was in control over yourself, your men, and the situations that could spiral into chaos if not handled carefully. By the late 1950s, Aniello Dellacroce was no longer just another face in the crowd. He had become a trusted lieutenant, respected by peers and feared by those who thought about crossing him. Yet despite his growing influence, he remained largely invisible to the public eye. His name appeared rarely in police files and almost never in the press. That was exactly how he wanted it. In his world, fame was dangerous. Respect and quiet power, those were the real prizes. His loyalty to the old ways and to the family would carry him through the decades ahead, even as the landscape of organized crime shifted with new personalities and new challenges. But in those early days, walking the streets of Little Italy where he had grown up, Aniello could look around and see just how far he had come from the quiet boy watching men in sharp suits pass by. Now he was one of them, though perhaps sharper, calmer, and far more dangerous than anyone could guess at first glance. The seeds of his future had been planted, and they were already growing in the shadows. By the early 1960s, Aniello Dellacroce's world was far more complex than the streets of his youth, yet he navigated it with the same quiet calculation that had served him well for decades. The city had changed, the skyline taller, the neighborhoods shifting, the old immigrant enclaves slowly giving way to new waves of arrivals. But in the undercurrent of New York, beneath the chatter of tourists and the rumble of subways, there was a structure that remained. The families were still there, each with their territories, alliances, and rivalries, and Aniello had secured his place deep within one of the most powerful. He was no longer the young man proving himself. Now, men sought his guidance. When there was tension between crews, his was the voice that could cool tempers. He didn't need to raise his tone. He didn't even need to threaten. Those who sat across from him understood that a man who didn't waste words also didn't waste time. If he said something would happen, it would. If he said something wouldn't, it wouldn't. That level of certainty carried weight in their world. Carlo Gambino had risen to lead the family by this time, and his leadership style mirrored Aniello's in many ways. Calculated, patient, focused on stability over reckless expansion. The two men had mutual respect, though their personalities were different. Gambino was often smiling, outwardly approachable. Aniello was more stoic, his expression giving little away. Still, the bond between them was clear. Gambino knew Aniello could be trusted with delicate matters, the kind of matters that could not be left to someone who craved the spotlight. The Ravenite Social Club had by now become more than just a gathering place. It was a hub of quiet authority. Aniello could often be found there, sitting in his usual spot, greeting men as they came in, listening more than he spoke. Outsiders might think it was just a group of men talking about nothing in particular, but in those conversations, decisions were being made that shaped the family's business. Orders were rarely given directly. Instead, ideas were floated, suggestions made, and those who needed to understand would understand. Aniello preferred it that way. A conversation was harder to trace than a command. His responsibilities grew to include oversight of certain unions, construction projects, and other ventures that kept money flowing steadily into the family's coffers. He had an eye for balance, making sure no one branch of their operations became too exposed. He believed in spreading risk and ensuring that everyone who was supposed to benefit did so. That way, there were fewer reasons for internal disputes. In his view, unity was not about sentiment, it was about shared interest. But the 1960s also brought changes that tested the old ways. Law enforcement was becoming more organized, more coordinated between agencies. Surveillance techniques were improving, and political pressure to clean up the city meant more eyes on the activities of men like Aniello. He adapted by becoming even more careful. Meetings were shorter, conversations more guarded. Trusted intermediaries were used when direct contact wasn't necessary. He didn't believe in taking chances, not with so much at stake. You could see his discipline in the smallest things. If he said a meeting would begin at a certain time, it began at that time. If he promised someone a cut of something, it would be there exactly as agreed. In a world where paranoia could undo alliances, his reliability was a rare anchor. It wasn't just fear that kept people in line with Aniello. It was the knowledge that he was fair. Fairness, in the underworld, could be a more powerful weapon than intimidation. His reputation outside the family began to grow quietly as well. Other families in the city respected him, and when disputes arose that crossed territorial lines, he was sometimes called in to mediate. He had the ability to sit at a table with men who didn't trust each other and leave with an agreement in place. This wasn't done with grand speeches or aggressive bargaining. He had a way of making each side feel as if they had gained something, even if they had compromised. Aniello's personal life was kept as private as possible. He didn't parade his family or wealth in public. He lived comfortably, but without the kind of extravagance that drew unwanted attention. His home was a place of calm, separate from the business. He understood the value of having a sanctuary where the constant negotiations and calculations of the streets couldn't reach him. Those close to him knew that his loyalty to the family he had built in blood and loyalty was matched by his loyalty to the family he had by bloodline. As the decade progressed, the younger generation in the streets began to look different from the men Aniello had come up with. Some were more brash, more eager for fast money and recognition. They didn't always share the patience that he and his peers had cultivated. This sometimes caused friction, as the old guard valued discretion while some of the new wave chased notoriety. Aniello believed that too much noise eventually brought the wrong kind of attention, and he often found himself trying to rein in those whose ambition outpaced their discipline. Still, he wasn't blind to change. He understood that the future would inevitably belong to those younger men one day, and he tried to guide them rather than crush their spirit. He would bring them into his circle selectively, letting them handle smaller matters to test their judgment. If they proved themselves capable of operating with the same restraint he valued, they could rise. If they proved impulsive, they would be kept at arm's length. The Gambino family, under Carlo Gambino's leadership, enjoyed a period of relative peace compared to the violent power struggles that had plagued other families. Aniello's steady hand as an underboss, though not yet officially holding that title, was a key factor in this stability. He managed people as much as he managed business, knowing that resentment or mistrust inside the family could be more dangerous than any rival crew. By the late 1960s, his influence was such that few major moves were made without his awareness. He wasn't always the one giving the final word, that was Gambino's role, but his counsel was sought often. If a proposal reached Carlo Gambino, it was usually because Aniello had already looked it over and found it worthwhile. This gatekeeping role allowed him to shape the direction of the family subtly, ensuring that risky or ill-conceived ventures rarely got off the ground. In public, he was almost invisible. In private, he was a cornerstone of the organization. This duality was part of what made him so effective. Law enforcement knew his name, of course, but without flashy displays or open acts of violence, there was little they could pin on him. The FBI was beginning to take a more serious interest in organized crime, but Aniello's preference for operating in the shadows made him a harder target than the headline makers. In those years, walking into the Ravenite and seeing Aniello Dellacroce there meant you were in the presence of someone who could change the course of things with a few quiet words. But he never acted like a man who enjoyed power for its own sake. For him, authority was a tool, one to be used carefully, never recklessly. That philosophy would guide him through the next chapter of his life, a chapter where his role would grow even more central as the winds of change began to blow through the Gambino family. The calm before the storm, they called it later. But for Aniello, it was just another phase in a life built on patience, discipline, and the certainty that no matter how much the world around him shifted, there was strength in knowing exactly who you were and how far you were willing to go to protect what was yours. The early 1970s brought a quiet but undeniable shift in the winds of New York's underworld. The old neighborhood lines were still visible, but they were blurring in subtle ways. New players were emerging, some with legitimate business fronts, others with operations that thrived in the shadows. The city was changing, and so was the landscape of organized crime. Aniello Dellacroce felt those changes long before most. He could sense when the balance was starting to tip, when the invisible threads holding things together began to tighten or loosen. He had learned over decades that nothing stayed the same forever. Even the most stable arrangements eventually faced the test of time. But his philosophy was simple: adapt without losing your core. That way, no matter how the environment shifted, you could remain standing. By now, Aniello had become one of the most trusted figures in the Gambino family. Carlo Gambino's quiet, deliberate rule suited him. There was no hunger for needless violence, no reckless expansion that could bring the whole structure crashing down. It was a time when stability was valued more than conquest. That stability made the family one of the most profitable in the country. While some other families battled each other for territory and reputation, the Gambinos consolidated their grip quietly, avoiding the kind of headlines that drew too much attention from the authorities. Aniello's role during this time was both visible to the inner circle and invisible to the outside world. He handled delicate matters, disputes between captains, negotiations with other families, and the smoothing over of situations that could otherwise become problems. He was known for his ability to listen. Men would sit with him for hours explaining their side of things, their frustrations, their ambitions. He would nod, take it in, and then respond in a way that made them feel heard, but also made clear where the boundaries were. The Ravenite Social Club continued to be his unofficial headquarters. Day after day, men came and went, some staying for a few minutes, others for longer conversations in the back room. Aniello sat in his usual chair, sometimes in deep conversation, sometimes simply observing. Nothing that happened there escaped his notice. If a man came in looking nervous, Aniello would see it. If someone seemed too eager about a new opportunity, he would note it. He believed that understanding people was as important as understanding money. Outside the club, his influence spread into legitimate businesses, trucking, construction, garment manufacturing, industries that could be both profitable and useful as fronts for other activities. Aniello was meticulous in keeping things balanced. If one venture started drawing too much suspicion, he would shift focus to another. It was like keeping plates spinning. You had to know which ones needed a push and which ones were better left alone for the moment. The FBI and local law enforcement were starting to pay closer attention. Surveillance vans became a more common sight. Wiretaps began catching snippets of conversations from phones thought to be safe. But Aniello's style made him difficult to catch in. Anything direct. He didn't speak carelessly, and when he gave instructions, they were often vague enough to be meaningless to an outsider, but perfectly clear to the person they were meant for. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to keep the peace between people who might otherwise be at each other's throats. This wasn't about friendship. It was about keeping the machine running smoothly. Internal conflict could drain resources, weaken alliances, and open doors for rivals. Aniello understood that the family's real strength came from unity, even if that unity sometimes required compromises or concessions. But as the 1970s progressed, a new challenge began to emerge: generational change. Younger men were coming up in the ranks, men who had grown up in a different world from Aniello's generation. They had seen the flashy lifestyles of certain high-profile figures and wanted that kind of recognition. Some drove expensive cars, wore custom-tailored suits, and made a point of being seen at the best restaurants. To Aniello, this was dangerous. Attention was a liability, not an asset. He tried to guide them, offering quiet advice, explaining how the ones who lasted longest were often the ones no one outside their world had ever heard of. Some listened and adjusted their behavior. Others nodded politely, but continued down their chosen path. Aniello didn't waste energy chasing after those who wouldn't listen. In his mind, experience was the only teacher for certain lessons. Still, he kept a watchful eye, ready to step in if someone's recklessness threatened the larger picture. Carlo Gambino's health began to decline in the latter part of the decade, though he remained sharp and in control for as long as possible. This brought a new layer of tension beneath the surface. The question of succession, who would lead the family after Gambino, was one that could not be ignored forever. Different factions quietly positioned themselves, forming alliances, testing loyalties. Aniello, ever the loyal lieutenant, did not make a grab for the top spot. That wasn't his way. His focus was on maintaining order, making sure the family didn't fracture during the transition. Outside the underworld, New York was facing its own troubles. The city's finances were in crisis. Crime rates were rising in the streets. The police department was under pressure to show results, which meant organized crime was once again a top priority. New initiatives were launched, new task forces created. The heat was turning up, and Aniello knew it. He responded by tightening operations even further, cutting back on unnecessary meetings and keeping communication lines as clean as possible. Through all of this, his personal life remained as private as ever. He avoided the kind of scandals that had brought down other men. His home life was shielded from the business, and while he was deeply respected in his world, he never confused respect with trust. Trust was rare and given only to a select few. By the end of the decade, Aniello was recognized, at least within the inner circle, as the man who held much of the family's structure together. If there was a dispute, it went through him. If there was an opportunity worth pursuing, he was consulted. His presence was steadying, like a pillar holding up a building. Without him, many suspected, things could start to crack. The 1980s were just around the corner, and with them would come a new wave of challenges, shifting alliances, ambitious rivals, and the growing influence of men who would change the family's public image in ways Aniello never embraced. But for now, in the last quiet years of Carlo Gambino's reign, Aniello Dellacroce remained what he had always been, a man of discipline, discretion, and deep loyalty, quietly shaping the fate of one of the most powerful crime families in America. The fall of 1976 marked a turning point in the quiet stability that had defined the Gambino family for years. Carlo Gambino, the man whose calm leadership had kept the family strong and steady, passed away at the age of 74. His death was not sudden, his health had been failing, but the loss was still deeply felt. For decades, Gambino had been the anchor, the voice everyone respected, the one who could settle disputes simply by making a decision and expecting it to be followed. Without him, the question became, who would take the helm? On the surface, the answer seemed obvious to many. Aniello Dellacroce had been Carlo's underboss for years, his loyal right-hand man, a figure trusted by captains and soldiers alike. He had proven himself time and again as a steady leader who could manage problems without creating new ones. But the underworld was rarely that straightforward. Power was not always passed to the most qualified. It was often shaped by alliances, personal relationships, and quiet deals, made long before the need for them arose. In this case, Carlo Gambino had already decided his successor before his death, and it wasn't Aniello. The reins would go to Paul Castellano, Carlo's cousin-in-law. Castellano was from a different mold than Dellacroce. Where Aniello was street-hardened, comfortable in the shadows, and deeply connected to the traditional rackets, Castellano was a businessman, more focused on legitimate-looking operations and distancing himself from the violence and street-level dealings that had built the foundation of the family's power. When the decision was announced, it created an immediate split. Aniello's supporters felt he had earned the position. Many of the family's blue-collar crews, the ones involved in construction, unions, and the more traditional trades of organized crime, saw Dellacroce as their true leader. Castellano's base of support came from the white-collar side, men involved in corporate fronts, wholesale food businesses, and schemes that were far removed from the grit of street operations. It could have turned into an all-out war within the family, the kind of internal bloodshed that had destroyed other organizations. But here, Aniello's character showed itself once again. Rather than challenge Castellano outright, he accepted the arrangement. Publicly, he pledged his loyalty to the new boss, telling his supporters that the family came first and division would only weaken them. Privately, he understood the reality. The split existed whether anyone admitted it or not, but he chose to manage it rather than ignite it. The two factions began operating in parallel. Castellano handled the higher-end schemes and the public image of the family, while Dellacroce continued to run much of the day-to-day street business from his base at the Ravenite Social Club. Castellano rarely ventured into Little Italy, and Dellacroce rarely set foot in Castellano's Staten Island home. The two men had respect for each other, but their styles were so different that they might as well have been running two separate companies under the same banner. For Aniello, this period required a delicate balance. He had to keep his men loyal to him without openly undermining Castellano. He also had to ensure that any disputes between the factions didn't boil over. There were moments when tempers flared, disagreements over territory, over money, over how certain problems should be handled. In those moments, Aniello would step in, using his calm, measured presence to cool things down. It was a constant effort, but he managed to keep the peace. Meanwhile, law enforcement was paying closer attention than ever. The FBI had shifted its focus toward dismantling organized crime families through long-term investigations, using new tools like the RICO Act. Wiretaps, surveillance teams, and undercover operations became more sophisticated. The days when you could assume a conversation in a corner booth was private were gone. Aniello knew this and adapted accordingly, limiting what was discussed in person and relying more on trusted intermediaries. Despite these precautions, he was not untouchable. In 1979, he was indicted on federal charges related to income tax evasion, a tactic law enforcement had famously used decades earlier against Al Capone. The charges carried the potential for prison time, but Aniello took it in stride. He had always believed that part of the life meant accepting that sooner or later you would have to do a piece of work in prison. In 1980, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years. For a man like Dellacroce, prison was not the end of influence. Even behind bars, he maintained contact with his people, passing messages through visitors and other means. His absence, however, gave Castellano more room to solidify his control over the family. Paul used the opportunity to further distance himself from street operations, which frustrated some of the old-school members who felt that was where their strength truly lay. When Aniello was released in the early 1980s, he returned to a family that was stable on the surface but divided beneath it. Castellano was still boss, but his leadership style was creating quiet discontent. He avoided face-to-face contact with many of the rank and file, preferring to issue orders through intermediaries. He was also making moves that blurred the lines between legitimate business and personal gain, sometimes at the expense of the street crews. Dellacroce stepped back into his role as underboss without missing a beat. He resumed his presence at the Ravenite, meeting daily with his people, hearing their concerns, and keeping operations smooth. To many in the family, he was the true leader they dealt with day to day. Castellano might hold the title of boss, but it was Aniello they trusted with their livelihoods and their problems. During this time, a younger figure began to emerge in Aniello's orbit, a man named John Gotti. Gotti was ambitious, charismatic, and brimming with street-level confidence. He had the loyalty of his crew and a knack for making money. Aniello saw potential in him but also recognized the dangers of unchecked ambition. He kept a close eye on Gotti, offering guidance and, when necessary, caution. The early 1980s brought new pressures from law enforcement. The FBI intensified its efforts against the Gambino family, placing bugs in meeting spots following members and building cases that could take years to come to fruition. Aniello understood the game. He knew the key to survival was discipline, avoiding unnecessary risks, keeping conversations clean, and ensuring the people around him didn't get sloppy. Despite these challenges, Aniello maintained his steady influence. He was not a man driven by ego or a need for the spotlight. His satisfaction came from keeping the machine running, from seeing problems solved before they became crises. He had lived long enough in that world to know that the loudest men often fell the fastest. By the mid-1980s, however, the tension between the Castellano and Dellacroce factions was growing harder to contain. The street crews felt neglected and undervalued, and Castellano's decisions, including moves that hurt their earnings, only deepened the resentment. Aniello worked tirelessly to keep things from boiling over, but he could sense the undercurrents shifting. For now, though, he remained what he had always been: the quiet hand steadying the ship, the bridge between two worlds, and the man whose presence alone could keep ambitious men in check. But the cracks were there, and Aniello knew that in their world, cracks had a way of turning into earthquakes. By the time the summer of 1983 rolled around, the Gambino family had been living with its quiet division for years. On paper, Paul Castellano was the undisputed boss. In practice, there were two beating hearts in the organization: Castellano's Staten Island base, which oversaw the legitimate fronts, and Aniello Dellacroce's Ravenite social club in Little Italy, which pulsed with the energy of the street crews. For a while, this arrangement worked because both men played their parts. Castellano preferred the distance, Dellacroce preferred the closeness, and they stayed out of each other's way. But beneath the surface, the resentment in Dellacroce's faction was slowly turning into frustration. The street guys, the bookmakers, the loan sharks, the crews running numbers and controlling the unions, were the ones facing the daily risks. They were the ones getting arrested in sweeps, the ones handling disputes that could turn dangerous in an instant. Yet they felt Castellano didn't value their contributions. He rarely met them face to face, and when he did, it was often to issue orders rather than listen. One of the sparks for the growing unrest was money. Castellano had been tightening control over certain revenue streams, pulling some of the most profitable rackets into his inner circle. This cut into the earnings of the street crews who felt they were being pushed aside in favor of Castellano's white-collar ventures. Dellacroce heard these complaints constantly. Sitting at the Ravenite, sipping his coffee, he would listen to captains and soldiers vent about how things were changing, how the family was starting to feel less like a brotherhood and more like a corporation with one man at the top. Aniello's approach was always the same. He would nod, let them speak their minds, and then remind them that unity was the only thing keeping them all strong. He had no interest in encouraging open rebellion. He knew how dangerous that would be, both for the family and for himself. But he also understood the anger. In private moments, he would admit to trusted friends that Castellano's style was creating a dangerous gap between the leadership and the men who actually made the family's money. Into this environment stepped John Gotti. By now, Gotti had proven himself as a capable and ambitious captain. He ran the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, and his crew was loyal to him without question. Gotti had a magnetic personality, the kind of man who could walk into a room and instantly draw people in. He also had a knack for making money in ways that didn't always stick to the rules Castellano wanted followed. Gotti admired Dellacroce and saw him as a mentor. The respect was mutual, though Aniello was careful not to let Gotti's growing ambitions run unchecked. He had seen enough young, ambitious men burn too brightly and too quickly. Gotti's charisma and appetite for power made him both a potential asset and a potential source of trouble. In 1984, law enforcement pressure began to intensify. The FBI was gathering intelligence on all 5 New York families, and Castellano was a prime target. Surveillance operations were picking up conversations, following movements, and slowly building cases that would take years to unfold. Gotti, too, had come under the microscope after a botched hit tied back to his crew. The danger wasn't just from rivals anymore. The government was becoming the most persistent adversary. Around this time, Castellano made a decision that deepened the divide. He began pushing a policy that certain profitable criminal activities, like drug dealing, were off limits for members of the family. Officially, the reason was that drug charges carried long prison sentences and intense law enforcement attention, which could hurt the family as a whole. Unofficially, many believed Castellano wanted to monopolize any high-risk, high-reward ventures for himself or his closest allies. This policy put him directly at odds with some street captains, including those in Dellacroce's sphere, who saw drugs as one of the most lucrative rackets available. It wasn't that Aniello personally encouraged drug dealing. He was old school in many ways, but he understood that trying to enforce such a ban was unrealistic. It only created resentment, and resentment was something the family could not afford. The undercurrent of frustration was now running just below the surface. Dellacroce's men grumbled more openly about Castellano's leadership. Gotti began to emerge as the voice of that discontent, speaking in private about how the family needed a leader who understood the street and respected those who worked it. Aniello, ever the steady hand, kept reminding everyone that acting on impulse could destroy them all. Yet even as he played the role of peacemaker, Aniello must have known that the situation was becoming harder to control. Castellano's detachment was alienating more people. His focus on business ventures, some of which benefited his relatives more than his captains, was eroding loyalty. The family was still outwardly stable, but inside, 2 factions were drifting further apart. In early 1985, the FBI struck a blow. Castellano and several high-ranking members of the family were indicted on a variety of charges, including racketeering and murder. For the first time, the boss was facing the possibility of a long prison term. Aniello, too, was dealing with his own legal troubles. The pressure was mounting on both sides of the leadership divide. Castellano's response to the indictments only added fuel to the fire. Rather than rally the family together, he became even more insulated, retreating to his Staten Island mansion and limiting his contact with most members. To many of the street guys, this was the final straw. They needed a leader who was present, someone they could see and talk to, not a figure who issued orders from behind guarded gates. During this period, Dellacroce's health began to decline. Years of living the life had taken a toll. Still, he remained a constant presence at the Ravenite whenever he could, meeting with his captains, keeping the lines of communication open. He understood that his very presence was a stabilizing force. Without it, the delicate balance might collapse. Gotti, sensing the shifting tides, stayed close to Aniello. He sought advice, discussed the family's direction, and watched carefully as events unfolded. For all his ambition, Gotti respected the old underboss and knew that Aniello's approval carried weight. The streets of Little Italy were buzzing with rumors by the fall of 1985. Whispers of a change in leadership were making the rounds. Some said Castellano might step down if the legal pressure became too great. Others hinted that certain captains were already discussing what might happen if he didn't. Aniello heard these whispers, but he never let them get past idle talk in his presence. In his mind, the family had survived because it avoided open conflict within its own ranks. The moment that unity shattered, they would all be weaker. But as the year drew toward its close, even Dellacroce must have sensed that he was holding back a tide that could not be stopped forever. What no one knew at the time was how quickly events would accelerate. In just a few months, the Gambino family would change in a way that would make headlines around the world. And Aniello Dellacroce, the man who had kept the peace for so long, would not live to see how it all played out. By the end of 1985, Aniello Dellacroce's health was visibly fading. The once imposing underboss, whose presence alone could quiet a room, was now moving slower, coughing more often, and spending less time at the Ravenite. His captains noticed it, his soldiers noticed it, and even his rivals noticed it. But Dellacroce never admitted weakness. He still showed up when it mattered, still listened to grievances, and still offered calm, measured advice that reminded everyone why they respected him so deeply. The Gambino family, however, was reaching a breaking point. The tension between Paul Castellano and the street faction loyal to Dellacroce was no longer just background noise. It was a constant hum, always there, impossible to ignore. Castellano's aloofness had turned into near isolation. He was seen less and less, choosing to spend most of his time at his mansion in Tote Hill, far away from the neighborhoods where the Gambinos made their money. This detachment was more than a personal choice. It was a statement, intentional or not. By staying away, Castellano was signaling that the day-to-day struggles of the rank and file didn't concern him. For a street-driven man like Dellacroce, this was a dangerous precedent. Respect in the life wasn't just given. It was maintained, nurtured, and earned through presence. Among those watching the situation carefully was John Gotti. His admiration for Dellacroce remained strong, but his patience for Castellano's style was wearing thin. Gotti understood the value of appearances. He knew that showing up to weddings, funerals, and neighborhood events was more than a courtesy. It was a duty. It kept the bond between a leader and his men alive. And he could see that Castellano's absence was creating a vacuum. In those days, Dellacroce still tried to keep his people in line. Even as his health worsened, he'd gather his closest men at the Ravenite, leaning back in his chair, sipping coffee, and warning against rash decisions. He had lived through enough mob wars to know how quickly ambition could turn into chaos. In his mind, as long as he was alive, there would be no move against Castellano. The risk of splitting the family and inviting bloodshed was too great. But privately, some of his captains wondered how long that restraint would last. The whispers had grown louder. Castellano's indictments were hanging over his head, and the possibility of a prison sentence made him seem vulnerable. If the boss were to go away, there would need to be a successor. Traditionally, the underboss was next in line. But Castellano had hinted to some that he might bypass Dellacroce's faction entirely, possibly naming someone from his own circle. This alone was enough to put the street faction on edge. Meanwhile, the FBI was tightening the net. Agents were following Castellano, tapping phones and planting bugs in meeting spots. They had also taken an interest in Gotti, whose crew had been linked to multiple incidents that caught law enforcement's attention. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew that at any moment, a sweep could come down and change everything. Aniello's illness was becoming harder to hide. He had lost weight, his once strong voice sometimes cracked mid-sentence, and there were days he simply couldn't make it out to the club. Gotti, aware of his mentor's condition, began visiting him more often at home. These visits were part loyalty, part strategy. Gotti valued Aniello's guidance, but he also knew that with Dellacroce's time possibly short, decisions about the family's future would soon be made, with or without him. In those quiet conversations, Gotti would bring up the state of the family, the growing frustration with Castellano, and the belief that the street needed a leader who understood it. Dellacroce listened, but he rarely gave Gotti the answer he wanted. Instead, he would caution him, reminding him that patience had kept many men alive in situations where others had fallen. "The streets don't forget, John," he'd say, "but they'll forgive a lot if you keep your head and wait for your moment." By late autumn, it was clear to those closest to Dellacroce that he was running out of time. He still had the respect of both factions. Even Castellano spoke of him with deference, but his ability to hold the fragile peace was slipping. Castellano, perhaps sensing that Aniello's passing would leave his flank exposed, made decisions that only widened the rift. He shuffled certain rackets, granting more control to his loyalists and less to those under Dellacroce's wing. To the street guys, this was an insult, a sign that Castellano was already looking past his underboss. The men loyal to Dellacroce began meeting in hushed tones without him. They didn't speak openly about defying his wishes, but the implication was there. If Aniello was no longer around to keep them in check, they would act. And at the center of these talks was John Gotti, the man many saw as the natural choice to take the reins if Castellano were removed. In the first week of December 1985, the news came quietly, but hit like a thunderclap in the underworld. Aniello Dellacroce had died. The illness he had fought for so long finally took him, and with him went the one figure who had managed to keep the Gambino family's two halves from tearing each other apart. His funeral drew a massive crowd. Men from every corner of the organization came to pay their respects. Even those who had little personal connection to him understood that they were saying goodbye to more than a man. They were saying goodbye to an era. John Gotti stood among the mourners, his face set, his eyes sharp. Castellano did not attend the funeral, citing legal concerns and the attention it would draw. This decision was seen by many as the ultimate insult. To the street faction, it was proof that Castellano had no respect for the traditions that bound them together. To Gotti, it was confirmation that the time for patience had passed. The days after Dellacroce's death were a turning point. The balance of power shifted almost overnight. With no one to mediate, the rift between Castellano and the street faction became an open wound. Castellano still had his loyalists, but they were fewer in number and less connected to the everyday workings of the street. Gotti, meanwhile, had the loyalty of the majority of captains who actually controlled the family's money-making operations. Conversations that had once been hypothetical now became concrete. Gotti and his closest allies began to outline a plan, not just for survival, but for a takeover. The danger was enormous. A failed move against a sitting boss could mean certain death. But with Dellacroce gone, there was no longer anyone to counsel restraint. The decision now rested entirely with those willing to risk everything. In the weeks to come, the Gambino family would undergo one of the most dramatic shifts in modern mob history. And while Aniello Dellacroce would not live to see it, the absence of his steadying hand would be felt in every decision, every conversation, and every move that followed. His death marked the end of the quiet balance and the beginning of something far more volatile. The days following Aniello Dellacroce's funeral felt heavy, like a thick fog had settled over the streets. For years, the underboss had been the invisible thread holding the Gambino family together. Now that thread was gone, and the edges were already fraying. Men who had once kept their tempers in check because Aniello asked them to, were now speaking more openly, voices rising in backrooms and corner booths. It wasn't just grief. It was the release of years of pent-up frustration. At the Ravenite Social Club, The mood had changed. Before, it was a place of quiet discipline when Dellacroce was there. His mere presence made people mind their words. Now the air was different. Looser, louder, more dangerous. Captains came and went, some keeping their distance from certain others, some lingering longer than usual to hear whispers about what might happen next. Paul Castellano's absence at the funeral had not gone unnoticed. In fact, it was the only thing many people were talking about. In the code of that life, showing respect wasn't optional. To most of the street guys, it didn't matter if you had legal troubles or were under surveillance. You showed up to pay respects to someone like Aniello. The fact that Castellano didn't come was taken as a personal insult to every man who had stood under Dellacroce's wing. John Gotti took it personally too. Standing there at the funeral, surrounded by hundreds of mourners, he had felt the anger in the air. Men came up to him, shaking his hand, leaning in to say things like, "Neil was the glue, John. Without him, it's up to us now." Or, "Paul's lost touch. It's time someone took care of business." For Gotti, it was no longer about patience. It was about timing. The opportunity wasn't just approaching. It was staring him in the face. Castellano was under multiple federal indictments. The government was circling closer with each passing month, and his support within the family was the weakest it had ever been. The problem was that making a move on a sitting boss wasn't like settling a street dispute. It wasn't just risky. It was against the very rules of the Mafia. Those rules had been in place for decades, designed to prevent chaos and keep families from turning on themselves. Breaking that rule meant one thing: you had to win, because there would be no second chance. Gotti began quietly building his inner circle. He spoke in careful, deliberate tones to men he trusted completely: Sammy Gravano, Frank DeCicco, Angelo Ruggiero, and a few others. These conversations weren't rushed. They played out over late-night meetings, sometimes in cars parked on side streets, sometimes in basements where no one could overhear. Each man needed to be sure that everyone else was committed, because once the plan was set in motion, there was no going back. The key was secrecy. Even one wrong word in the wrong ear could ruin everything. Castellano still had loyalists, and some of them were sharp enough to sense when trouble was coming. If word reached him before they were ready, Gotti and his crew would be finished before they even started. Meanwhile, Castellano himself seemed to be making decisions that fueled his enemies. He was planning a meeting of his closest allies to discuss the future of the family, but none of the prominent captains from Dellacroce's faction were invited. To Gotti, that was the final confirmation. Castellano was cutting them out entirely. By mid-December, the plan had taken shape. It wasn't just about removing Castellano. It was about doing it in a way that left no doubt who would lead afterward. The location would be critical. Somewhere public enough to catch Castellano off guard, but controlled enough for the shooters to escape quickly. The answer came when they learned that Castellano would be attending a dinner meeting at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. The days leading up to the meeting were tense. Every conversation carried the weight of finality. Gotti knew that if this went wrong, it would be the end of him, his crew, and possibly anyone even suspected of being involved. But he also knew that hesitation could kill a plan faster than bad luck. Once the men were committed, he pushed forward. They studied the route Castellano would take, the timing, and the escape paths. The shooters were handpicked. Men who could be trusted not just to do the job, but to keep their mouths shut afterward. The getaway cars were positioned. The signals decided. Nothing was left to chance. On the afternoon of December 16, 1985, Manhattan was cold, the streets dusted with a thin layer of snow that had fallen earlier. Gotti and DeCicco waited nearby, watching from a car as the moments ticked by. Sparks was lit up for the holidays, the kind of warm glow that made passers-by linger at the windows. But for the men in the cars, there was no warmth, only the razor-sharp focus that came with knowing they were about to change the history of the Gambino family forever. When Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up in front of the restaurant, the shooters moved quickly. What happened in those seconds would be whispered about in backrooms for decades. The street erupted into a brief flurry of chaos before the men vanished into the winter night. leaving the boss of the Gambino family lying on the pavement. Back at the Ravenite, the news traveled faster than anyone expected. Some men looked shocked, others simply nodded, as if they had been waiting for this moment since Dellacroce's passing. Within hours, it was clear who was now in control. John Gotti had stepped into the role not by vote, not by appointment, but by action. The move was bold, unprecedented, and dangerous, but it had worked. And while the newspapers the next morning would carry headlines about the brazen hit outside a Manhattan steakhouse, the men in the life understood something deeper. This was the end of Castellano's era and the beginning of the Gotti years. In quiet moments, Gotti thought of Dellacroce. He knew Neil wouldn't have approved of the hit, at least not while he was alive. But Gotti also believed that without Aniello there to protect their interests, the street faction would have been slowly pushed aside until there was nothing left. In his mind, this was survival, even if it meant breaking the very rules Neil had always respected. The city's underworld was now watching closely. Some saw Gotti's move as a masterstroke of leadership. Others saw it as reckless, the kind of thing that could invite unwanted attention from both rival families and law enforcement. But no one could deny that it had changed the game entirely. And in the weeks that followed, as Gotti took meetings at the Ravenite, his tailored suits catching the light, his laugh filling the room, there was an unspoken truth among the men. Aniello Dellacroce's death had been the spark, but the fire now belonged to John Gotti. In the days after the Spark Steakhouse hit, New York felt different. Not to the average person walking down Fifth Avenue or catching the subway to work, but to those in the life, the shift was unmistakable. The Gambino family had just gone through the most public, most brazen change of leadership anyone could remember. It wasn't done quietly in a back room or settled over a bottle of wine in some dimly lit corner. It had happened in the middle of Manhattan, with holiday shoppers passing by, neon lights glowing in the cold December air. The newspapers couldn't get enough of it. Headlines screamed about the Mafia boss gunned down in Midtown and mob murder in the heart of the city. Television reporters stood outside Sparks every night for a week, pointing to the spot where Paul Castellano had fallen. Law enforcement agencies, federal, state, and local, were suddenly buzzing with activity, their attention now squarely fixed on the Gambino family. Inside the Ravenite Social Club, John Gotti was already making moves. He had always been confident, but now there was an ease to the way he carried himself, like a man who had just played the most dangerous hand of his life and won. He didn't hide from the attention. In fact, he seemed to welcome it. He'd walk through the streets of Little Italy in perfectly tailored suits, smiling at the press photographers who camped outside the club. It was a style that was the complete opposite of Castellano's approach. Paul had been private, preferring the quiet safety of his Staten Island mansion. Gotti, on the other hand, embraced the streets. He was visible, approachable, and to many in the rank and file, he was exactly what they wanted in a boss. But visibility came with a price. Every time Gotti stepped outside, there were eyes on him, not just the eyes of his men, but the eyes of the FBI, the NYPD, and even rival families who were curious to see how long his reign would last. It was in these early days of his leadership that Gotti began to realize just how heavy the crown could be. One of the first things he did was reward loyalty. The men who had stood by him in the planning and execution of the Castellano hit were given more influence, more opportunities to earn. Sammy Gravano was elevated in status, not just as a trusted advisor, but as someone who could handle sensitive matters. Frank DeSico, who had been instrumental in the plot, was now one of Gotti's closest allies. Promotions and new responsibilities were handed out like signals to the rest of the family. If you backed the right man, you'd be taken care of. But there were still pockets of resistance. Some old-timers had been loyal to Castellano to the end, and though they kept their voices down, Gotti knew they were watching him closely, waiting for him to make a mistake. These men were dangerous not because they had numbers, but because they understood the rules of the life and how to use them. Gotti needed to keep them close enough to monitor, but not close enough to interfere. Meanwhile, the FBI wasn't wasting any time. Agents began compiling a fresh set of files on Gotti, tracking his movements, photographing every person who entered or left the Ravenite. They pulled informants into rooms and asked about his habits, his meetings, his money. The Bureau had already been watching him before Castellano's death, but now they were on him day and night. Gotti didn't seem to mind. He played a kind of game with them. When he left the Ravenite, he sometimes made a point of smiling directly at the agents sitting in their unmarked cars. He'd wave or even send a young guy out to bring them coffee as if to say, "I know you're there, and I don't care." It was part bravado, part psychological warfare. The agents hated it, but they also couldn't help but note that he was unlike most mob bosses they had encountered. Despite the attention, Gotti's early months in power were marked by a sense of momentum. The street guys, the bookmakers, the loan sharks, the guys running numbers and collecting envelopes, felt like they had someone in the big chair who understood them. Gotti had come up through the same trenches they had. He knew what it meant to stand on a corner in the dead of winter, waiting for a payoff. He knew the risks of running a game in a neighborhood where the wrong cop could ruin your week. And because he understood, he made sure the money kept flowing down as well as up. But Aniello Dellacroce's shadow was still there, quietly guiding certain decisions. Gotti often thought back to the way Neil had handled disputes, with a calm voice, a patient ear, and a refusal to let emotions override business. Gotti didn't always have the same patience, but in those moments when tempers flared among his captains, he tried to remember how Neil would have diffused the situation. It wasn't about pretending to be Neil. It was about recognizing that some of his wisdom had kept the family strong during turbulent times. As winter turned into spring, the Gambino family began to settle into the new order. There were still challenges, rival crews testing boundaries, law enforcement breathing down their necks. But for the most part, the transition had been smoother than anyone could have predicted. Part of that was because Gotti had acted quickly after the hit, filling leadership gaps before anyone else could make a move. Part of it was because Castellano's absence had left certain men hungry for change, and Gotti had delivered that change in dramatic fashion. Still, he knew the danger wasn't over. If history had taught him anything, it was that the life could turn on you in an instant. Allies could become enemies, fortunes could disappear overnight, and one bad decision could put you in a cell, or worse. For now, though, he was on top, and he intended to stay there. In quiet moments when the club had emptied out and the city's noise faded into the distance, Gotti would think about Neil. He'd picture him sitting in his usual chair, cigarette in hand, watching everything with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Gotti knew he was leading in a way Neil never would have, but he also knew that without Neil's years of protection and guidance, he never would have gotten this far. It was a strange kind of inheritance, one not given in money or property, but in influence, in lessons learned, in a name that still carried weight long after the man was gone. The streets had a way of erasing people quickly, but Aniello Dellacroce's name was still spoken with respect, even by those who now called Gotti boss, and in some unspoken way that respect helped keep Gotti's early reign steady. The men who had loved Neil were willing to give Gotti a chance, not because they trusted him completely, but because they felt Neil's spirit still lingered in the choices being made. For the time being, that was enough. The city would keep moving, deals would keep being made, and the Gambino family would keep earning. But beneath it all, everyone knew that the real test wasn't how Gotti took power. The real test would be how he kept it. By the summer of the first year under Gotti's leadership, the Ravenite Social Club had become more than just a headquarters. It was a symbol, a place where people came not only to conduct business, but to be seen. Associates from every corner of the city wanted to shake the boss's hand, share a drink with him, maybe get their face remembered. The club was busy from morning until late into the night, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and the smell of espresso brewing in the back. Gotti's way of running things was drawing attention from both sides. On the street, many loved him for it. He would stand outside the club, well-dressed, smiling, chatting with neighborhood people as if he were just another friendly face from Mulberry Street. But law enforcement saw something else. A boss who didn't hide, who seemed to think the rules didn't apply to him. It didn't take long before the FBI decided to tighten the net. Surveillance teams rotated shifts outside the Ravenite, cameras hidden in vans, agents posing as delivery men, or even as tourists with cameras slung around their necks. Every visitor to the club was photographed, every license plate recorded. They began to identify patterns: who came on which days, how long they stayed, who they spoke to. The constant presence of the FBI wasn't new to Gotti, but now it was heavier, more organized. Agents began following him when he left the club, trailing his car through traffic, sometimes keeping the tail so close that he'd make sudden turns just to watch them scramble. It became a game he liked to play, but games have consequences. The higher the profile, the greater the risk. Some of the older captains in the family started to grumble in private. They had lived through other eras, under bosses who had kept things quieter, who didn't draw unnecessary attention. The Ravenite had always been busy, but now it was the center of a storm, with television crews sometimes showing up just to film Gotti walking in or out. For men who valued discretion, this was a dangerous way to operate. John, of course, wasn't oblivious to this tension. He'd hear the whispers, the small comments passed between trusted men. But his confidence was unshaken. He believed his approach inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure, and that was exactly what a boss needed to stay in power. Still, he understood that the FBI's presence wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a real threat. Every time he met someone at the Ravenite, there was a chance that the conversation could be recorded, the movements analyzed. To counter this, he started holding some meetings in different locations, walks around the block, drives through quiet streets, or gatherings in apartments where no one was watching. But habit and pride often drew him back to the club. It was his stage, and he wasn't ready to give it up. Meanwhile, business continued. Construction deals, unions, gambling operations, they all fed the family's income. Gotti made sure money flowed both up and down the chain. Crews were kept busy, and the envelopes they sent up were thick. In many ways, this steady cash flow quieted dissent. A man might not agree with how the boss handled himself in public, but if his pocket was full, he had less reason to complain. Still, the danger wasn't only from law enforcement. Rival families were watching closely. The Castellano hit had been bold, but boldness invited envy and fear. The other families of New York, the Genovese, the Lucchese, the Bonanno, the Colombo, they all had men wondering if Gotti's ambition might someday spill over into their territory. For now, the commission kept things civil, but tensions in the life could shift quickly, and everyone knew it. Within the Gambino family itself, alliances were constantly being tested. Loyalty was a currency, and it could be bought, traded, or lost. Men who had been close to Castellano but had accepted Gotti's leadership still carried old loyalties deep down. These weren't the kinds of grudges that disappeared overnight. They could wait years for the right moment to resurface. Gotti, for his part, knew how to manage men. He had learned from watching Aniello Dellacroce, who had kept the family stable for years despite deep divisions. Neil had taught him the importance of listening, of making every man feel heard, even if you didn't agree with him. Gotti couldn't always match Neil's patience, but he tried to apply the principle. Every once in a while, Gotti would bring up Neil's name in conversation, sometimes as a way of honoring him, sometimes as a reminder of continuity. Neil looked out for his guys, he'd say. That's how I do it too. For the men who had loved Dellacroce, this was enough to soften their doubts, at least for the moment. But the FBI didn't care about loyalties or history. They wanted results. By now, they had begun building a more complex case against Gotti, using wiretaps and informants. They knew that if they could catch him discussing business, even in vague terms, they might have enough to bring charges. They placed listening devices in places Gotti thought were safe, including apartments above the Ravenite. Sometimes Gotti would sense that something was off. He'd cut conversations short, change subjects abruptly, or move meetings outside. But other times, confidence overrode caution. and words were spoken that couldn't be taken back. The agents working the case often talked about Gotti's presence. They admitted, even grudgingly, that he had a certain charisma. But they also knew charisma wouldn't protect him forever. The more time they spent watching, the more confident they became that they could eventually make a case strong enough to stick. Through all of this, Gotti kept up appearances. He attended social events, family gatherings, weddings, and baptisms. He sent gifts to men in prison, made visits to the sick, and paid respects at funerals. These gestures were more than kindness. They were a way of reinforcing his image as a boss who cared for his own. In the life, such gestures mattered. They built bonds that could last through hard times. But no matter how smooth things seemed on the surface, the pressure was building. The FBI's net was slowly tightening. Rival families were watching for cracks, and inside the Gambinos, old loyalties still simmered beneath the surface. The lessons of Aniello Dellacroce's era were still there for Gotti to draw on, but whether he would lean on them enough, or in time, was another question entirely. For now, the city kept moving. The streets around the Ravenite were alive with noise, the traffic constant, the faces familiar. Men came and went, deals were made, money changed hands. And above it all, John Gotti stood as the boss of the Gambino family, his reign still young, his confidence unshaken, the memory of Aniello Dellacroce still lingering in the corners of the room. The winter winds had returned to New York, sweeping down Mulberry Street and rattling the windows of the Ravenite Social Club. Inside, the warmth of the old radiators fought against the cold, and the regulars were gathered around small tables, playing cards or sipping coffee. Outside, the scene was far less casual. Unmarked cars were parked at strategic angles. Men with cameras and long coats leaned casually against lampposts, their eyes never straying too far from the entrance. The FBI had settled in for the long game. They knew that taking down John Gotti wouldn't happen overnight. They had watched men like him before, smart, cautious, and surrounded by loyal associates. But they also knew that even the most disciplined man could be caught if you gave it enough time. Patterns formed, habits solidified, and eventually, opportunities appeared. Inside the bureau, the Gotti squad had grown. There were surveillance teams dedicated solely to following him and his closest people. There were wiretap specialists who listened to hours of recordings, sometimes just to catch a single phrase that hinted at something bigger. Informants were cultivated slowly, often from the lower levels of the organization. Guys who had a taste for gambling or drugs and found themselves in debt, or men who had been arrested and were facing years behind bars. The real breakthrough came not from the street, but from the air above the Ravenite. The FBI had managed to plant listening devices in the apartment upstairs, where Gotti often held private conversations with his closest captains. It was a bold move and a risky one. Any sign of tampering could blow months of work. But for now, the bugs were in place, and agents were beginning to pick up the murmurs of conversations that Gotti never expected anyone outside his circle to hear. The tapes revealed more than just business. They showed the dynamics of the family, the way Gotti handled disputes, the way he spoke about his rivals, the occasional flashes of temper when something wasn't going his way. Even the smallest details mattered to the agents, because each piece could fit into a larger puzzle. Meanwhile, life inside the Gambino family carried on. Crews brought in steady money through construction rackets, gambling, and loan sharking. The unions were still under influence, and certain businesses across the city paid their quiet tribute. For most of the soldiers and associates, day-to-day life wasn't dramatically different under Gotti than it had been before. The envelopes still went up, the orders still came down. But there was a shift in style. Things were louder, more visible. Some of the older captains still didn't like it. They would gather in quiet restaurants in Brooklyn or Queens, away from the eyes of the FBI, and talk about the old days. Under Aniello Dellacroce, they would say, the streets were quieter. The boss didn't parade himself in front of cameras. He moved carefully, never giving the FBI more to work with than they already had. Neil had been respected by everyone because he balanced power with subtlety. One night, over a quiet dinner in a dimly lit back room of a Bensonhurst restaurant, An older captain named Joe leaned across the table to another man. "John's gonna bring too much heat," he said in a low voice. "This isn't Neil's way. The Bureau's not just watching, they're circling." The other man nodded but said nothing. In their world, talk like that could be dangerous. Even if you thought it, you didn't always say it out loud. Still, the unease was real. Gotti, for his part, was aware of the whispers. He had his own sources, people who told him what was being said behind closed doors. Sometimes he laughed it off. Other times, it irritated him enough that he'd call a meeting just to remind everyone who was in charge. He believed in loyalty, but he also believed in making sure that loyalty was never taken for granted. The FBI's patience began to pay off in subtle ways. On one recording, they caught Gotti discussing the fallout from a dispute over construction jobs. The words weren't a direct admission of anything illegal, but they hinted at control and decision-making that could be valuable in court. On another, they picked up conversations about past hits, vague, coded but still revealing to trained ears. Every scrap of information was logged, analyzed, and compared with other pieces of intelligence. Over months, a picture began to emerge, a picture of a boss who was more involved in day-to-day operations than he liked to admit publicly. Even as the FBI tightened its grip, Gotti kept his routine. The Ravenite remained his stage, and he liked to make an entrance. He'd arrive in sharp suits, his hair perfectly in place, his smile easy. Neighborhood people would greet him warmly, and he'd stop to chat, as if he were just another familiar face on the block. This charm made him dangerous in the eyes of law enforcement. He wasn't just feared, he was liked. But behind the charm, there was calculation. Gotti knew the FBI wanted him, and he knew they were listening. Sometimes he'd deliberately say things to throw them off, to create confusion. He'd talk in circles, drop names without context, or use vague phrases that could mean one thing or another. He believed that as long as he stayed a step ahead in his words, they couldn't pin anything on him. Still, there were moments when caution slipped. A late-night meeting might run too long, or a conversation might get too specific. And every time that happened, the FBI's case grew a little stronger. Through it all, the memory of Aniello Dellacroce still lingered in the background. Men who had known Neil would occasionally bring him up, often in comparison to the current way of doing things. Neil wouldn't have sat here with all these cameras outside, one old-timer muttered one evening at the Ravenite. Another replied quietly, "Neil's gone. This is John's world now." And so the world kept turning. The streets of New York remained busy. The deals kept happening. The envelopes kept moving. But the walls were closing in, slowly, silently. The FBI had time, and they were willing to wait. Every winter storm that passed over Mulberry Street brought them closer to the day when they would knock on the Ravenite's door, not to watch, but to act. For now, Gotti stood tall, confident in his ability to outmaneuver anyone who came for him. But the city had seen men like him before, and it would see them again. The game was still in motion, but the pieces were shifting, and somewhere in the quiet halls of the FBI, they were already mapping the next move. By the time another year rolled around, the Ravenite Social Club had become more than just a meeting spot. It was a stage. Every evening, John Gotti would arrive in tailored suits and polished shoes, looking like he had stepped out of a magazine spread. People from the neighborhood, shop owners, delivery men, and even young kids, would nod or wave as he passed. He'd smile, shake hands, and exchange a few friendly words. On the surface, it all looked harmless. But for the FBI agents parked just down the block, every handshake, every conversation, every entrance and exit was a piece of evidence. The bugs planted in the upstairs apartment were doing their job. Agents would spend long hours listening to crackling audio, sometimes catching nothing more than the scrape of chairs or the sound of laughter. But every now and then, a gem would slip through, snippets of conversation that hinted at decisions being made, money being moved, or grudges being settled. The words were careful, often coded, but to experienced ears, they spoke volumes. One of the regular voices on those tapes belonged to Sammy Gravano, Gotti's underboss. Gravano spoke in a lower, steadier tone than Gotti, but he had a sharpness to his words. He had earned his position through years of work and loyalty, and he was trusted with details that most men in the family would never hear. The agents quickly realized that following Gravano's movements could be just as valuable as tracking Gotti himself. Inside the Gambino family, business was steady, but not without tension. Some of the older captains still preferred the quiet, almost invisible approach that Aniello Dellacroce had embodied. They remembered how Neil would speak softly, keep his moves discreet, and always avoid giving law enforcement any unnecessary openings. But Gotti was different. He had a taste for visibility, for the public image of a man in control. And that image, while it won him fans on the street, was exactly what the FBI was using to build their case. The Bureau's investigators began cross-referencing the recordings from the Ravenite with surveillance logs from the street. If Gotti was recorded upstairs discussing a meeting, the agents could match that with photographs or video of who had gone in or out that day. Over time, they started to piece together a network of connections, a map of who met with whom, when, and under what circumstances. Every piece of information was documented, no matter how small. An overheard complaint about someone not paying on time, a mention of a union contract being delayed, even idle talk about who was falling out of favor with the boss. It all went into the growing file. The FBI knew that taking down a man like Gotti required not just one big break, but a mountain of smaller ones. Still, Gotti seemed unfazed. He continued to host his regular gatherings at the Ravenite, continued to stroll the sidewalks as if he had nothing to hide. In his mind, the FBI couldn't touch him unless someone on the inside turned. And in his world, loyalty was supposed to be absolute. But loyalty, the FBI knew, could be tested. All it took was the right pressure in the right place. And sometimes that pressure came not from the outside, but from within. As the months passed, whispers began to circulate about disagreements between Gotti and some of his men. Nothing explosive, just quiet frustrations, someone feeling underpaid, another believing they deserved more influence. These things had a way of simmering, and the FBI was listening carefully, hoping to catch signs of cracks in the foundation. Then came a break the agents hadn't expected. A lower-level associate, facing charges unrelated to the Gambino family, hinted during questioning that he knew about certain meetings at the Ravenite. He didn't know the full details, but he knew enough to suggest that bigger things were being discussed upstairs. It wasn't enough to make a case, but it confirmed to the FBI that their wiretap operation was pointed in the right direction. The agents redoubled their efforts. They refined the placement of the bugs to improve sound quality, adjusted surveillance schedules to make sure they never missed a key moment, and worked behind the scenes to keep their operation hidden from the very men they were following. Meanwhile, Gotti's public image was only growing. Newspaper photographers caught him coming and going from court appearances related to old charges. Crowds gathered to see him, and he often played to them, flashing smiles or offering quick comments to reporters. To the public, he was becoming something larger than life, a man who seemed untouchable. But inside the FBI, they saw it differently. They saw a man who was giving them more and more opportunities to gather evidence, simply by living the way he did. One cold night, Gotti and Gravano were recorded discussing a problem with a business deal. The details were vague, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone had crossed a line and there would be consequences. The words themselves weren't enough for an indictment, but they showed a willingness to act, and that willingness could connect to other evidence down the line. The agents clipped that section of tape and filed it alongside reports from informants who had heard similar complaints. Slowly, the threads were beginning to tie together. All the while, the memory of Aniello Dellacroce lingered like a shadow in the background. Men who had been loyal to Neil still spoke of him with a certain reverence, remembering the quiet authority he carried. Some wondered if things would have been different had Neil lived longer, if the FBI's eyes would have been so focused, if the family's business would have stayed more in the shadows. But Neil was gone, and Gotti's way was the way now. The FBI, for its part, didn't care about nostalgia. They cared about building a case solid enough to withstand trial, one that could put Gotti away for good. And with every conversation recorded, every movement tracked, they were inching closer to that goal. Still, the agents knew that patience was key. Rushing the case could lead to mistakes, and mistakes could mean watching all their work crumble in court. So they waited, even as the streets outside the Ravenite buzzed with life, even as Gotti's name continued to make headlines. They knew that somewhere in those hours of tape, somewhere in those hundreds of surveillance photos, was the piece they needed. And when they found it, the man who walked so confidently down Mulberry Street would find himself facing a very different kind of stage, a courtroom, where charm meant nothing, and the only audience that mattered was a jury. The winter winds that swept through Little Italy that year seemed sharper than usual, slicing through the narrow streets and rattling the windows of the old buildings. But inside the Ravenite Social Club, the warmth of conversation and the faint scent of strong espresso filled the air. Men laughed, argued, and leaned in close over the hum of the street outside. On the surface, it was just another gathering of friends. Beneath that surface, it was the heartbeat of a machine that had been running for decades. By now, the FBI's operation had entered a new phase. They were no longer simply collecting sounds and snapshots. They were building connections, creating timelines, and layering facts until they formed a picture that even the best defense attorney would struggle to explain away. The recordings they had captured from upstairs, grainy, muffled at times, were beginning to intersect with real-world events. A delayed payment here, a union issue there, a whispered complaint about someone not playing by the rules. When matched with street-level reports from informants and confidential sources, these pieces began to form a clear narrative. For Gotti, life seemed to go on without interruption. He still wore his expensive overcoats, still made his rounds through the neighborhood, still flashed that self-assured smile that made reporters swarm. To him, the Ravenite was a sanctuary, a place where business could be handled among trusted men. He wasn't naive about law enforcement watching him. He knew they were out there. But in his mind, they'd never get close enough to touch him. But the truth was, they were closer than he realized. Sammy Gravano, the underboss who'd been at his side, was proving to be a key figure for the FBI, not because he was cooperating yet, but because his conversations with Gotti were rich with hints and half-spoken agreements. The agents had learned how to read between the lines, to hear the meaning in what wasn't said as much as in what was. A remark about taking care of something could, in the right context, be tied to an assault that happened days later. A passing mention of a guy who didn't deliver could match perfectly with the timeline of a union contractor being pressured. And as much as Gotti liked to think his words were vague enough to keep him safe, the agents knew that juries didn't need every word spelled out. They just needed enough to connect the dots. What the FBI didn't expect was how internal dynamics would soon work in their favor. In organizations built on loyalty, betrayal often comes not from strangers, but from men who once stood at the right hand of the boss. Resentment is a quiet poison. It can sit for years, invisible, until one moment tips the balance. Tensions inside the family were rising in subtle ways. Gravano, though fiercely loyal in appearance, was feeling the weight of certain decisions. Some of Gotti's moves brought attention Gravano didn't want. The underboss was an operator, efficient, calculating, and far less flashy than his boss. He preferred when business ran quietly, smoothly, without the glare of the media or the constant buzz of federal surveillance. But with Gotti in the spotlight, that kind of calm was becoming impossible. Meanwhile, some captains whispered in corners, careful not to let their words travel too far. They wondered if Gotti's style, so different from Dellacroce's, would eventually bring the whole house down. They remembered how Neil had run things, low profile with an iron grip that never needed to be flaunted. To them, the current climate felt risky. The FBI's presence was constant, the cameras always seemed to be watching, and the press treated Gotti like a celebrity instead of the head of a criminal empire. The Bureau noticed these cracks. They knew that conflict, Even quiet conflict could lead to opportunities. Informants were probed with carefully chosen questions. Rumors were fed back into the streets to see who might bite, who might react. Patience was still the most valuable tool they had, but they were no longer just waiting. They were steering the wind ever so slightly to see which way the sails would turn. One cold evening, as snow began to fall over the city, a meeting upstairs at the Ravenite took a sharper tone than usual. The bug picked up the sound of chairs scraping back, voices rising, then settling again. The words were measured but tense. Someone had overstepped in a deal, and the fallout was becoming a problem. Gotti's voice cut through, calm but with an edge, the way a blade catches the light. Gravano's reply was steady, but there was a hint of strain behind it. The agents listening didn't have the full picture yet, but they had enough to know that relationships inside weren't as smooth as they appeared on the street. From that point, the investigation took on an even more methodical pace. The FBI wanted not just to bring charges, they wanted to bring the kind of case that would stand no matter how many appeals were filed. They started linking specific statements from the Ravenite tapes to actions carried out by men in the field. A casual mention of straightening out the situation could be matched to a known shakedown. A joke about teaching someone respect lined up with a bar owner suddenly changing his tune about payments. Piece by piece, they were weaving a net. What neither Gotti nor Gravano knew was that the Bureau was also looking for leverage points, people with just enough grievance or just enough fear to start talking. They didn't need the whole circle to turn. They just needed one voice from the inside, willing to confirm what they already suspected. And then, slowly, that opportunity began to form. A longtime associate facing a hefty prison sentence on unrelated charges began making noises about cutting a deal. He wasn't in Gotti's immediate circle, but he knew enough about the way business flowed, enough about who was connected to whom, to give the agents valuable insight. In exchange for some leniency, he offered to fill in the gaps. Details about money drops, about how messages were relayed, about which meetings were worth paying attention to. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a start. From there, the Bureau sharpened its focus. They began watching Gravano more closely, noting when he arrived at the Ravenite, who he met afterward, and how his demeanor changed over time. They could sense the weight he carried, the subtle way he seemed to measure his words more carefully in Gotti's presence. To an outsider, it would have been impossible to see. To trained investigators, it was a sign that the dynamic was shifting. By the end of that winter, the FBI had not only hours upon hours of recorded conversations, but also a detailed map of relationships inside the Gambino family. They knew who spoke to whom, who passed messages, who collected envelopes, and who acted when orders were given. And perhaps most importantly, they knew that time was working in their favor. Men like Gotti believed that control was permanent, that as long as they commanded loyalty, they were untouchable. But history had shown that loyalty was a fragile thing, and when the right pressure came from the right angle, even the strongest ties could snap. The Bureau didn't need to rush. They could afford to wait for the moment when those ties began to fray, when the man standing closest to Gotti decided that survival meant stepping away from the boss and stepping toward the government. That moment was coming. And when it did, everything Aniello Dellacroce had built, everything Gotti had claimed, everything the Gambino family believed was unshakable, would be tested in ways they had never imagined. The wind off the East River that night carried the kind of cold that made even the toughest men pull their coats tighter. In the dim streetlights, the sidewalks glistened faintly from a recent dusting of snow, and the city seemed to move slower, as though winter itself had pressed a heavy hand on every rooftop. Inside the Ravenite Social Club, though, the air was thick with warmth, the bitter scent of coffee, and the low murmur of voices. John Gotti sat at his usual spot, leaning back in his chair with that familiar air of confidence, talking with Sammy Gravano about an issue that had been simmering for weeks. They spoke in their way, careful, measured, weaving around certain words as if avoiding stepping on cracks in the sidewalk. Even in their caution, there was meaning. Every nod, every glance, Every pause told more than the words themselves. The FBI, listening through the hidden microphone upstairs, could sense that something was shifting. It wasn't just the content of the conversations anymore. It was the tone. Gravano's replies carried a slightly different weight, and Gotti's manner of speaking seemed just a shade sharper, more insistent. The agents had learned over months to hear those changes, to treat them as signals. For years, the Bureau had been assembling its puzzle, and now they were closing in on the final pieces. The tapes alone would be powerful, but they still needed that human voice, a witness from inside, to give those recordings context that couldn't be explained away as just talk. And as they watched Gravano, they saw a man at a crossroads. It's a strange thing, the way loyalty can feel solid one moment and uncertain the next. Gravano had built his life around a code, around standing beside the boss no matter what came. But that winter, pressures from all sides began to crowd in. There were legal troubles on the horizon, whispers in the streets about upcoming indictments, and the constant grinding reality of being under surveillance every time he stepped outside. He noticed the way unmarked cars would idle down the block just a bit too long, the way cameras seemed to follow Gotti whenever he left the club. The media painted the boss as untouchable, but Gravano knew better than to believe in myths. No one stayed untouchable forever. The FBI had a quiet patience about them. They didn't need to push. They knew that men in Gravano's position eventually began to measure the balance sheet of their lives, what was worth protecting, and what was worth surviving for. It was never a quick decision. It was a slow erosion, like the tide eating away at a dock piling until one day it simply gives way. In private moments, Gravano started to think about the past, about Aniello Dellacroce and how differently things had been run under his watch. Dellacroce had understood discretion in a way Gotti never seemed to. He'd preferred quiet efficiency over headlines. Gravano respected that, maybe even missed it. Now, with Gotti in the spotlight day after day, Gravano found himself wondering if the glare of all that attention was blinding them to the danger ahead. The Bureau didn't know the full extent of Gravano's doubts yet, but they could feel the temperature changing. Their informants in the outer circles began reporting small details, a remark here, a frustrated look there, that hinted at cracks forming. Meanwhile, the legal noose was tightening. Grand juries were convening, subpoenas were going out, and behind closed doors, federal prosecutors were laying out the bones of a case they believed could finally bring Gotti down. It was a careful build, designed to leave no gaps for him to slip through. When the indictments finally came, they landed like a hammer. Charges ranging from racketeering to conspiracy to commit murder were laid out in stark legal language. Gotti, defiant as ever, smiled for the cameras, brushing it off like a man brushing snow from his coat. Gravano, though, didn't smile. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as if he were taking stock of a very different kind of weather. Jail changes a man's perspective in ways the street never can. Locked away, time stretches differently. The routine grinds on, and the mind begins to replay every decision that led there. For Gravano, the walls seemed to close in faster than they ever had before. The government's evidence wasn't just about the tapes. It was the combination of those recordings, surveillance photos, financial trails, and the testimony they were quietly lining up. In their shared legal strategy sessions, Gotti remained his usual self, confident, charming, sure that they could beat the case like they had before. But Gravano felt the weight of something else entirely. The prosecutor's confidence was too steady, too measured. They weren't bluffing. They had more than enough to keep them at the table. The days turned into weeks, and the whispers inside the detention center grew louder. The FBI wasn't approaching Gravano directly yet, but the signals were there. Other inmates passing along quiet messages, small reminders that cooperation could come with benefits. Gravano didn't bite, not then, but the thought was planted, and it stayed with him, even when he tried to shove it aside. One evening, alone in his cell, Gravano thought back over the years, the sit-downs, the late-night walks after meetings, the way Dellacroce used to end conversations with a simple nod instead of a speech. He thought about how everything had changed since those days, how the shadows had turned into spotlights, and how those